well, thanks everyone for hopping into our breakout session today, Navigating Leadership Today. We'll introduce ourselves here shortly, but again, if you have any technical assistance issues or any technical glitches, Jude will be monitoring our chat for this session. So if you have any issues or anything, please either direct message or put in the chat box any issues that you have. Again, if you get bumped off or you lose the Zoom service or internet service, you'll be, when you log back on, you'll be back in the main room where Megan will be, and she'll bump you to or set you up so that you can join whatever breakout session that is in progress. So we are going to start off by introducing ourselves. I don't think I need to introduce myself again since I just spoke, but again, my name is Nigel Perrote. I'm the National and State Director here for the SVJI at NCASA. I have been in and out of the sexual assault field for 14 years, I think. I was just actually thinking about this today. Me and Jude, we've known each other for a really long time, and I was trying to figure out how long we've known each other, because I think that kind of facilitates my entirety of career working directly in the sexual assault field. Prior to this, I worked for the Department of Public Safety, where I helped coordinate, or I was our tribal liaison for the Minnesota State Department of Public Safety, but I was also coordinating our state's multidisciplinary response for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Task Force. I've also done some multidisciplinary work under our state safe harbor system, where we work with youth that have experienced sexual exploitation and trafficking, and worked within the Arrowhead region here of Minnesota with 7 different counties, and helping them develop and support bettering the responses to youth that have experienced sex trafficking, exploitation. And I chipped my teeth on multidisciplinary SART work with Jude, actually, who at the time was the Hennepin County SMART team coordinator, where I just by chance met Jude. We talked about sexual assault, and at the time I was working with an agency in South Minneapolis supporting the urban Indigenous population, and we were seeing a lot of sexual violence happening and being perpetrated. A lot of our folks, we primarily did domestic violence within our, I'm sorry, I'm getting a breakout room. We'll close in 100 seconds. So can you message Megan, Jude,
yes,
and see what it's about? If we do accidentally get kicked off here, we could just hop back onto the session. So that's how I got connected with Jude and recognized that there was a significant gap in the response to Native victims in South Minneapolis around sexual violence. At the time, I was working with homeless youth primarily, and a lot of the youth that I was working with, I would say 99% of the time, one of the preceding issues that they had was not just the experience of homelessness, but also either a sexual assault crime that has happened against them. Definitely were involved in domestic violence, and but also had experiences with people that were experiencing trafficking or sexual exploitation. So when I got connected with Jude, I was on the Hennepin County SMART team, providing a perspective from the Indigenous lens in the work. And we were also the pioneering Hennepin County SMART team. So all the members that were there were new, and that the Hennepin County SMART team was new. And as part of my role on the SMART team as well, I was elected to be one of our co-chairs in supporting Jude as our site coordinator and supporting the work of the Hennepin County SMART team. I think we're going to get kicked out. I apologize for everyone.
it's happening to everybody, I guess.
Let's hold off on introducing yourself, and if we get back in the main room, just right. Sorry about that, everyone. Give a moment here to get people back in the room, and I will pull up our presentation again as well. Sorry about that again, Jude. Would you please introduce me?
That was kind of funny. I don't know. I laugh when things like this happen because what else are you going to do? Cry? My name is Jude Foster, and I had a very long job title, and now it just got longer. So I am the statewide medical forensic policy program senior coordinator. And I am also in another role currently. I'm the interim advocacy and prevention team manager. I work in both the Sexual Violence Justice Institute and the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I have been an advocate for 28 years. Basically, what my pattern is that I go work for an organization, I leave, and then I come back. So this is my second time at MNCASA. I have been at MNCASA this time since 2016. And my experience with SARTs is I have been on 4 SARTs. 2 of them I founded, and I led 3. So yeah, Nigel and I have a rich history. I met Nigel when I founded the Hennepin County SMART team. And yes, Nigel ended up being one of our chairs of the SMART team. And then Nigel will tell you that I tricked him into moving to Duluth when I was at PAMSA for 3 years. So he wasn't necessarily on our SART in Southern St. Louis County, but he definitely participated and presented. And now we're reunited again at MNCASA, and it's really fun to work with Nigel.
Do you want to give the backstory on this photo?
Oh, yes. Okay, so when we were at PAVSA, which was in Duluth, we had a fundraiser every Valentine's Day, and it was called the I Heart Consensual Sex Party. And I love this picture because Nigel looks so grumpy. But Nigel was my Valentine date, which he gets mad every time I say that, but it's true, he was.
I was trying to remember why I was so grumpy, and I think the reason I was so grumpy is like, who wants to work Saturday night? Like your day off with for a good cause, getting the word out about sexual violence and consensual sex, but then being at a place where people are getting drunk and you can't get drunk. So I think that's why I was grumpy. So our learning objectives today, and crafting this, we really thought about the work and experience that both me and Jude have brought, and our experiences working in SART work and the other multidisciplinary teams of understanding what today's environment looks like. When the Hennepin County SMART team was founded in 2013 or 14.
What? Ask that again.
Hennepin County SMART team was founded.
That started in 2011.
2011. There was a lot of things that have happened in the last decade that really, I think, has facilitated a different way to kind of do the work and challenges that exist today that didn't exist 10 years ago. I mean, I just think about the technical advancements that have been made in the last year that people didn't have to deal with 10 years ago. This is kind of a real informal conversation. I think the way we kind of also pose this is oftentimes when me and Jude are outside of our kind of normal working environment, all our conversations tie back into sexual violence and the nature of sexual violence and the nature of our movement. It wasn't because of the pandemic, we can't have those opportunities anymore, but it wasn't unusual at Sunday brunch where we'd have a whole conversation about the movement of sexual violence and find that the people sitting next to us were either like interested and engaged in our conversations, or were like, what are these 2 people, 3 people, 4 people that are talking about sexual violence talking about? And so a lot of what we'll be sharing today is just based off our experiences that I think are, the way that people experience them will probably look a little different, but I think a lot of the things in terms of the larger scale, 30,000 foot view are pretty, I would say, consistent and maybe universal. And throwing a pandemic on top of that, and throwing a call for public safety reforms of that, I can imagine. And we've heard it a lot too within the technical systems that we do, like just having these conversations today. It's not just about kind of difficulties in having an honest conversation with each other and kind of not taking it too personally, but it's just about people just feeling worn out from being in the pandemic and doing this work in a way that just isn't how we typically do this work. And then, you know, to have a lot of your members that are on your team that are working as first responders or working with people that are in crisis because of the pandemic. So I hope today that what we share with folks kind of really gives, you know, not just some new tools and skills, but hopefully reaffirms and keeps people motivated in this work moving forward. Jude, I will toss it over to you.
I think you went.
Oh, I did.
Yeah. There we go.
There we go.
Okay, so I think one of the things when you are leading a SART, I kind of giggled to myself just now when I saw the learning objective that said potential conflict. If you are a successful team and if you are actually doing the work, you're going to have conflict. Teams that are not storming. So people talk about teams forming, storming, and then norming. If you're not storming, you're not doing the work. And I see in this room, there are several people that I know from Minnesota. Hello. For those of you that aren't from Minnesota or have never been here, we have a thing here called Minnesota Nice, which is really code word for passive aggressive. And the ex-New Yorker in me gets in a lot of trouble because I'm like, let's talk about it. And everyone's like, no, please, for the love of God, don't do that. I am currently working with the statewide sexual assault kit initiative grant. Many of you are familiar with those grants. It's looking at cold cases and looking at the accumulation of unsubmitted kits. And recently, we had a doozy of a meeting where it started out with somebody talking about why aren't we testing adjudicated cases, and everybody went crazy, right? Like, oh my God, we don't want to have this conversation right now. And then later on, an advocate said, I don't want to apologize on behalf of law enforcement to victim survivors. Again, room went crazy. And it was really interesting to me watching the fallout after that meeting, because I was getting phone calls, our site coordinator was getting phone calls, and I feel like we need to have that space to have those bold and brave conversations. And you know what? It's not always going to be a safe space. When people talk about safe spaces, I don't think you're doing the work. I think you can make those spaces safer. I think you can have agreements with your team on how you're going to talk through things. But I know some people were upset with me because I didn't shut down that conversation. And the reason I didn't shut it down, no one was attacking anybody. No one was yelling at anybody. No one was engaging in harmful behavior. What people were really upset about was having those conversations. Nigel, do you want to talk about calling in versus calling out?
Yeah, I think this really ties back into how you're setting up your team from the beginning, you know, looking at what are your values and your vision of the work that you're doing. And, you know, as Jude said, you know, the work is about either you're forming, you're storming, or you're norming. And part of the norming is what are those norms that you're developing in spaces that you can have these, you know, tough conversations. You can have these conversations in a way that are critical of the work that you're doing and understanding of each of the perspectives that everybody's bringing to the table. You know, I think sometimes there are opportunities for those critical conversations to happen there and really be kind of honest about it without feeling either like you're being attacked or if it's being overly critical. And, you know, again, I think I'll probably be repeating this a lot through there. In the Tuesday session, there was just a lot of things that I think I heard from Strong Oak that was like, yeah, I'm going to talk about that again on Thursday. And yeah. I mean, at a certain point, I almost said to Jude, it's like, we should just replay Strong Oak's conversation from Thursday and break it down piece by piece and apologize with the leadership for SART, SART coordinators and the work that they do. But I was thinking about this, the piece that we're coming in here for, that we're talking about, at the core of the work that we're doing, it's about the response to victims of sexual violence. You know, people that are coming into these rooms are coming in these spaces and having these conversations, and are representing the different systems and structures, you know, representing their experiences and how they've done this work. And so I think it was really important and really shone a light on me that I kind of still processing about those structures pieces. I think we can be critical of the structures we work with. And so someone that just came from a state government and came from a city government before that, I find it hard pressed sometimes now that I've been on both the nonprofit side and the community service side and being on the government side, that for people that work in the government, that everything works for you the way it's supposed to work for you and everything functions the way it's supposed to function. And that's not true. And so I think there is a level of just the honesty that you have to have coming to the table. Like, we are here for the sole purpose of recognizing that there are gaps in our system and there are responses that are failing. Otherwise, why are we at this table for not acknowledging those? I think when we talk about calling in versus calling out, I look at calling in as kind of being more that positive and constructive way of how you address these conflicts and how you navigate these conversations in a way that is, you know, critical and constructive, versus calling out where I think it is. You know, I think we are coming in here and we know that each of the different system players that have and structures that have a piece in the sexual assault response, I think we know what the issues are, and we don't have to kind of negatively dwell on those pieces as we're talking about the work. But I think the other thing too, recognizing that sometimes we have to, you know, again, coming from the mindset of someone that's in government, that came from government, is that, you know, criticism of what's happening for structures shouldn't be taken personally as your experience as the individual within that structure. I think the way I would oftentimes look at it, you know, when I first started at the Department of Public Safety, every conversation I had with various tribal leadership and various tribal police departments was just having to respond to things that sometimes I wasn't even alive for that happened 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And I did take it personally. Like, I wasn't there and I wasn't responsible for it. Yeah, but I am in a position now where I could do something different, or I could figure out how do we develop and how do we do a different change. And sometimes, you know, it wasn't me that was responsible for this whole thing, but I felt like I had the ability and the wherewithal to acknowledge those harms that have happened and say, you know, I'm sorry this happened to you. Like, I apologize. You know, looking forward or moving forward, how can we address this moving forward so that this is an issue again? So, you know, really being able to recognize calling out versus calling in, understanding like I'm part of the system, yeah, but I am also there as not just a, well, I'm there to help support it in a way that makes it more responsive. I think another piece too, I mean, this is another piece when you kind of think about what bringing you to the table and kind of that values and visions piece is, what are those commonalities? You know, what are those like truths that we can all agree to? You know, Strong Oak talked a little bit about the truths, and not all truths are, you know, everyone has a truth, but not necessarily all truths are valid. But when we're talking about commonalities and truths, you know, what are the things that we can all agree on coming to the table that we can have consensus on right away to kind of build out as we, you know, work through some of these conversations, or we have to be really conscientious about kind of some of the failures, like understanding, I think, a common truth that we can all work from that kind of brings us to the table. It's like, at the end of the day, this is about the survivors and the victims of sexual violence. And if we can all agree to that, regardless of what conflict happens or what, you know, happens in these conversations that may become a little heated, I think we have to remind ourselves at the end of the day, it's not about me, it's not about you, it's not about anyone at this table, it's about what works for us and what will help support the victims and survivors that are coming through our systems. And then I think another thing too that I kind of didn't think about in terms of conflict is I think the way we respond sometimes, and Jude kind of talked about this a little bit about Minnesota nice. I'm from Wisconsin, so I never was raised around the concept of Minnesota nice, and generally it is kind of a speak your mind type thing. And I think sometimes our experiences when we think about passive aggressiveness, it kind of ties into people's extroversion or introversion, and I think sometimes reading people's extroversion introversion is kind of important because sometimes, because someone's quiet, it doesn't mean that they don't agree with anything that you're talking about or they're against anything you're talking about. As an I'm an introvert, I would say generally. The things I don't like doing is talking to people and presenting, and that's what I have to do in this job every day almost. Like I'm introverted and I recognize that. And that's how I work around kind of addressing conflict as well. I would say I'm not necessarily conflict adverse, but it takes a lot for me to think about and do a lot of introspection on how to address something that's working through conflict that happens. And so I think recognizing those individual, not just as a group as a whole, but also recognize those individual conversations. Sometimes you might need to have a conversation outside of the full meeting, and sometimes you need to talk to quite a few people, kind of how Jude was just mentioning. But I think an important part of that, depending on your style, whether you're introvert or extroverted, is being able to bring that back to the group as a whole, have those conversations. Anything you want to add, Jude, on this navigating conflict?
No.
Oh, the other thing I'd probably add here too is having constructive conversations that facilitate growth. At the end of the day, I think conflict is about growth. And so if you can have constructive conversations that result in growth out of conflict, I think that is really a key and important value of conflict. So like Jude said, like if you're not storming, like then you're probably not doing your work the way you need to be. I think, in the work that me and Jude did together when we were on that thing called the SMART team, I think when you're thinking about leadership and the work that you're doing as a site coordinator, you're also thinking about who on that team of those leaders, whether you're co-chairs or whether they're some other structure that kind of develops your leadership. Looking at that, I think I learned a lot and I grew a lot from my work, having that connection of Jude as our site coordinator and me as our co-chair, to be able to have those conversations when I felt like something maybe went wrong, or maybe I didn't catch something I was supposed to, or if I was debriefing. And I think a lot of times those opportunities to have constructive conversations, whether it's in your team meeting or if it's outside your team meeting, like I really use those as opportunities to facilitate growth and address just developing more experiences of the work. Comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think a lot of people have struggles being in situations that make them uncomfortable. And when you talk about uncomfortability, I think our fight, flee response comes in. And so I think for people, and I know for me especially, like I really want to like address it right away. So we kind of move past that uncomfortability. But as I've learned and I've grown in that experience, I find that there's a lot I actually can learn from being uncomfortable in uncomfortable situations. But I think sometimes it really helps me think about and do some introspection with kind of why did I react the way I reacted, and really talk through it and think about it. And another thing I was thinking about from the conversation that John had on Tuesday about not just that violence that happens and perpetuates, as I mentioned before, both internally and externally. I find sometimes when I'm reacting and feeling uncomfortable, it's usually, oh, there was a trauma that happened to me when I worked in this place. And I tie it back into that and think through it like, okay, now I know why I reacted the way I reacted. Recognize that next time I have a tell that I could tie into and address or approach a situation a little bit differently, where I don't feel like I'm being put on the spot or I'm responding in a way that maybe is not the most positive way or the constructive way. And so I really look at opportunities for uncomfortability to learn for myself. I think it was a skill that I was able to develop being an advocate, I think in any situation or scenario, as you're working with victims, there is a lot of uncomfortable moments. And I think to skip ahead a little bit, that piece about silence, like there's a lot of time within that silence to learn about something or to speak about it or learn, figure out kind of what's happening. That you can kind of rethink your work or rethink your approach. And I think oftentimes we have a tendency to fill that void of silence, again, because it's creating an uncomfortable situation for us. And so I think a lot of times when you let that silence kind of linger, I think especially for me, I enjoy kind of lingering in that silence because like I said before, I'm a thinker and I think a lot. So I kind of really have to process things. As an introvert too, I also think about things in that moment of silence because I want to say something that is constructive, and I want to say something that I think is really worth saying and not just saying something because I'm uncomfortable or I just need that void of silence to be filled. And I think people that know me and have worked with me probably have seen that as well, is that I generally tend to keep quiet the entire time during a meeting. And then at the end, I will say something usually that either reaffirms or kind of challenges what the way people are thinking or how they're doing their work. That taking kind of working backwards, that taking that time to process as well. At a situation with that I was working on with the MMIW task force, where we had a member that was a former law enforcement, but worked as a tribal leadership and an advocate. And we're having a conversation around kind of victim-centeredness of why a victim or survivor may not reach out to law enforcement to report sexual assault that may happen to them. And so the conversation was between two people that were really extroverted, kind of really big personalities. And so as we were kind of talking, I had another colleague that was one of our co-facilitators, and we just happened to be on a phone call, so we were able to kind of message each other. And I was like, I feel like this is going towards like a really sensitive topic area or controversial, or people are going to kind of get really emotional here. I think for me, and looking at that situation when I was debriefing afterwards, I felt like an uncomfortable moment was coming. So I was trying to cut off that uncomfortable moment without recognizing there was a legitimate response from the law enforcement person. It was like they were really honestly and earnestly trying to understand why someone wouldn't respond to a law enforcement officer. And for him, I think it was a kind of a cultural thing there, working for tribal law enforcement versus working for non-tribal law enforcement, where he felt like in his work that he was doing, he was very victim-centered when he worked for the tribal law enforcement agency versus I think broaderly we were talking about the county sheriff and the local non-tribal law enforcement agency. And so I think if I shut that down in that moment because I was feeling uncomfortable, I don't think we would have actually had a learning opportunity there. And so to have an actual honest conversation that kind of clicked for him, was like, oh, I get it. I understand why someone may not want to reach out, especially if I'm a Native woman talking to a white deputy, a white sheriff that may not know me or may not understand my situation or doesn't understand or know how to work with a Native victim. And one of the things that we talked about when I was debriefing for my co-facility afterwards too, and whether you're doing this alone or you have someone that you can talk to, whether it's another colleague on your team, your supervisor, someone, having that opportunity to process and debrief from that, I think we're able to talk through it. I think that's how I was able to identify I was felt an uncomfortable situation happen. I was trying to cut it off before it could happen. And, I acknowledge that and I need to understand, we need to have that uncomfortable conversation next time so that we could all learn from this in an earnest and honest way. Anything you want to add here, Jude?
Just that SART work is messy. It just is. It's messy. And one of the things that I smile is particularly with advocates, somehow we understand silence and giving people the space and time to process when we're doing direct services, right? Like if you don't feel comfortable, you have no business facilitating a support group, right? Or even doing one-to-one counseling or those kinds of things. So as advocates, like we get that, but then somehow like when we're in a SART meeting, like all of that goes out the window. So yeah, that's all I wanted to add, Nigel.
I believe the next slide is yours, Jude.
It sure is, Nigel. So okay, so you're working with your team. You've formed, you've stormed, you've normed, and now you're like creating great work, right? And I will say that protocol development, and I'm probably going to touch on this later as well, but the actual protocol that you might be working on, or guidelines, or whatever you want to call them, that typically hasn't been the thing that I've been the most proud of in working with teams. I think what I've been the most proud of in working with teams are the relationships that are built, and kind of like that transparency, that understanding of what all of the partners are doing. That's what I am the most proud of with teams that I've worked with. But you're doing this work. How are you going to get the word out about the work you're doing? You know, I talk about this a lot. Like at the end of the day, like I'm accountable to my boss. I'm accountable to a board of directors. But at the end of the day, I'm really accountable to victim survivors. So I need victim survivors to know the work that we're doing, and I need to let the community know about the work that we're doing. So what is your team's communication strategy? And I have been on teams that have struggled with this. And I think some of that, particularly here in Minnesota, in the last 3 years now, there's been the media has played a huge role and actually pushing some of that systems change. So the Minneapolis Star-Tribune did a series that was up for a Pulitzer Prize. It did win an Emmy because it had a video component, but it was called the Denied Justice series. And it really dug into what was happening with investigations around sexual assault. And one of those reporters left and went to kind of a flashy news channel. And they have a series called The Untested. And just really digging into why does Minnesota have so many partially tested kits, and when were you going to get around to testing those partially tested kits, to more things about investigation, to all of these things. So sometimes the media can help you tell that story. You do want to have a good relationship with the media because they can turn on you. These reporters that I talked about, I know in Duluth, they were doing some reporting that was problematic. And that multidisciplinary team site coordinator reached out to the media and said, can you see how this could be re-traumatizing or re-victimizing? So the other story I love to tell is there is a sheriff in a rural county in Montana, and he was the sheriff, but he was trying to get the municipal law enforcement agency involved with his team. And he wouldn't come on board. He wouldn't come on board. He wouldn't come on board. So the sheriff pitched a story about his team to his local newspaper. Local newspaper came out and took a picture of the team and put it on the front page of the paper. And then that police chief felt quite foolish that he wasn't involved with this team. So the sheriff got a call like the next day from the police chief asking, how can I work with your team and how can I be on your team? I also just think, I mean, it's really practical things too, right? Like going out into the community. We talk a lot at the SVJI about cross training, but really letting your community know this is the work that we're doing and this is how we're moving forward with the way that we're going to investigate cases, prosecute cases, charge cases, and give victim survivors the support that they need. And this third bullet point, talking about systems change is not always easy. I think it's hard. And going back to something that Nigel said earlier, like, I think people take it personally. And no, we're not responsible for things that happened 40 years ago. But I'll give you a really good example. One of my colleagues at MnCASA is working right now on a statewide investigative protocol for cold cases. And there was an investigator that was really upset that my colleague used the phrase mishandled cases. And so we were kind of getting input from law enforcement all over the state because we wanted rural communities represented, smaller cities. So it wasn't just like a Twin Cities metro protocol. So we were talking to a police chief in northern Minnesota, and he said, yeah. You guys, you can't say mishandled cases. You've got to use language like practices or outdated practices or practices that were used at the time. And sometimes you can kind of feel like you're playing a game. But I always go back to, and I quote Dr. Dorothy Edwards, who's the founder of Green Dot, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? Right? So sometimes you do have to think about how you're communicating about the work, because at the end of the day, I want law enforcement to be reading that protocol and I want them to be implementing it. Nigel, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think one of the things when you're thinking about your communication strategy is, within your team, I think understanding what the limits are. I know with some folks that are coming from governmental agencies, whether it's prosecution, a government or county-based advocacy system, or law enforcement agency, there's oftentimes really, I don't want to say strict, but there's a lot of bureaucracy when it comes to who can speak to media and when and how and what is actually going to be said. So I think, coming into a team and, as part of, I think, your first steps when you're thinking about a team, and not necessarily even like your first steps, but when you're kind of getting ready to publish your protocol and pushing it out, and what is that communication strategy that's tied into that. But thinking about who, agreeing on who will speak for the team, agreeing on what are those messages that you want to push, making sure everyone else is prepared, even if they're not, the, representative that's going to be speaking for their organization, whether it's the talking points or the issue briefs or whatever you put together and decide on, making sure everyone has access to that and are able to speak to the work in a way that is representative of the work. I think other things to think about too when you're thinking about your communication strategy, like at the end of the day, you may, even if you go through and you have conflict and you don't resolve it, or consensus is not necessarily going to be 100% some of the times. I think also building in your communication strategy, like it's okay to talk about what maybe again, not trying to do it in a way that's negative or attacking or just defeats the entire purpose, but again, we want to have honest conversations about this protocol is missing this, this is what I'd like to see in our next generation, or understanding again what are those struggles when you're talking about system change, and how it comes about, especially in a situation I think that I had when we were doing our MMIW task force was, right away, one of the first things we developed was a communication strategy. One, because not, being able to do this work in a way that is coming from a government agency that's leading this, being able to address all those bureaucratical hurdles. And then two, oftentimes knowing that cases that happen with Indigenous women and men and two-spirited other non-binary Indigenous people, those cases and those whether it's a sexual assault or a murder or missing, those oftentimes don't get a lot of airplay, or they're not in mainstream media. Like I think nowadays you do see it a little bit more. You probably see it a little bit more online, but I think it was kind of an importance of our communication strategy, as well as like being able to bring awareness to this issue and talking about it in a way that is, it's so complex sometimes when you talk to someone about the jurisdictional hurdles of Native people, whether they're getting sexually assaulted or have a crime committed against them on the reservation versus off the reservation. Like I've done trainings where I could spend a whole day talking about jurisdictional complexities and tribes, and that only covers the surface of it. So now I'm expected to have a 30-second soundbite that covers 400 plus years of policy. So that, really is important when you're talking about your work. And, at the end of the day, you could do like a 30, 45-minute, hour-long interview with your local media, but 10 to 30 seconds at the most is going to be what you actually see in the report or the paper or whatever you may have. So I think really thinking about, what are your messages you want to portray? Who is that spokesperson for your team? That was, like I said, the first few things that we put together in our MMIW task force. Unfortunately, I got elected to be the spokesperson as the task force coordinator. I'm glad people trusted me. I don't know. I would take advice from someone that works with the government in a way that is conscientious about this issue, but I mean, it wasn't the struggle I found. I think the struggle I had with this is like at the end of the day, with the report that we put together, it was really critical of the state's response to these crimes. And I had a lot of concern that as a governmental agency, we didn't want to highlight that. But I didn't get any pushback on that, but I also didn't get like people, touting it out day to day. So that was kind of an important piece to, when you're thinking about big projects that are coming out of your team, or if you're starting off your team, what is that communication strategy that you have in place to talk about your work? Jude, I think this is still you.
It is still me. So traditionally, when we talk about SARTs, I think we think about protocol development, and that's the way that you're going to address gaps in your community and in your systems. And while that is true, again, like I said before, the protocol or the guidelines is not what I've been the most proud of in working with teams. It's been working together. It's been understanding where other systems are coming from. And I think, when we talk about policy, I think we think, like Nigel talks about little p and big P when it comes to policy. And I think, there's a lot of things that we can address in a protocol or in guidelines, but there's a lot of things that you just can't get there. I'm going to give you a really good example, and there are a couple of people on this call who will know what I'm talking about because they were part of this. So when I came back to MnCASA in 2016, I was doing a lot of work around medical forensic compliance. So for those of you who don't know, if your state is receiving STOP funds through the Violence Against Women Act, if you are found to be out of compliance, your STOP funds can be jeopardized. So that's why basically I have a job, is to try to make sure that Minnesota is in compliance. And one of the things that I was learning through teams is that we had a sexual assault kit storage problem, right? And it was like in County X, right? Like I would go to their team and law enforcement was saying, we don't want to hold these kits because if they're not reported, then they're not really evidence. Hospitals were saying, no, 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 this is evidence, my friends, and it's inappropriate for us to store them. I'm thinking about one community that I came in to try to like mediate between law enforcement and the SANE program there. And at one point I said, you know, how many kits are we talking about? And they said 10. I was expecting them to say like 150. And I was like, oh my, you guys are going to let 10 kits destroy the multidisciplinary relationships that you've spent the last 20 years building? Are you kidding me right now? But what made me think was, if this is happening in County X, where else is it happening around the state? And that's what really inspired MnCASA. We passed some major legislation in 2018 and then again in 2020. And the work that SARTs were doing was really inspiring us to make that change, because that's how we were hearing. I'm not going to call you out, but there's somebody else who's on this call who's just been trying to get a medical forensic response in her community. And that team I have never seen that kind of creativity. I mean, these people have thought of everything, and it's the whole team. So that's something that, you know, we need to start thinking about, because just slapping it in a protocol isn't necessarily gonna fix it. Nigel, do you want to talk about local level impacts?
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about that. I think Jude kind of alluded to this. Oftentimes the work that we see that's happening, it's happening usually at a statewide level. And so again, when I talk, as Jude mentioned, I talk about policy from a big P perspective, which is like your state and national, federal legislative changes, and your small p being those local level changes, that local level implementation of those larger P policies. And so when you're thinking about your work in the perspective of not just addressing the needs of sexual assault victims and survivors, but with the people that are coming to that table, you know, how are those other local level impacts that you're kind of utilizing? I think sometimes, as Jude mentioned, with the work that we do with some of our state SART teams, that really helps us think about our work from the perspective of our coalition side and our public policy agenda there. You know, I think you have you know, your law enforcement representatives, how are they feeding that experience or that response into their work, whether it's at their county sheriff's association or their police chiefs or their peace officer association, and the work that they do with their legislative policy. For county attorneys, how is that being fed back up? I think those are oftentimes the natural places we see this work being done. But this is something I don't think we did a ton of when we were on the Hennepin County SMART team. I think primarily because we were a newer team, and the things that I know now that I wish I knew then, hindsight is 2020. But thinking about your work, because you're doing this work oftentimes from a local level, whether it's a large city, urban area, or if it's for more rural areas, probably within a county relation, or a few counties, or a few towns and cities within a county. Thinking about, as you talk about this work, and as Jude mentioned before, we talked a little bit before, that ties into kind of getting this word out, is like, it's not easy to talk about system change. And so when you're thinking about your communication strategy, like, are you talking to like your local representatives, state representatives? Are you talking to like your local city council, your mayor, or your city manager? Are you talking to your county board about these issues? And I think those are like, I think, especially nowadays, we find that, we definitely know at the federal level, getting policy legislation passed is kind of maddening, and has been a marathon versus a short jog. And oftentimes what we see is that at the local level, you can make some of those impacts happen quicker. I mean, even talking about at the state level, I think people that may be aware with Minnesota, like, we ended our legislative session this year without a budget. Now we have a special session that needs to happen before the end of the year. So your work, the work that you're doing in the local level, I think that's prime for opportunities to make some of those local changes happen. How you're informing your local officials, how you're informing, whether it's your county sheriff, if you have, we talk about the feedback loop in the work that we do. People that are coming into the table and representing, they're supposed to feed back the information back to their their supervisors, their directors, their boards, what have you. But oftentimes I think we know that that isn't always the case. And so again, when you're thinking about your strategies and rethinking how do you make local level impacts, like those other folks on that team, how can they help support that feedback loop as well and bringing that information back, especially at a local government level, to kind of make some of those changes. Working for the state and working for the city, I've noticed that oftentimes your elected officials don't necessarily want to hear the work or hear the perspective of like the bureaucrat coming from the perspective of being a bureaucrat, but they will, 9 times out of 10 listen to their constituencies, whether it's their community-based organizations. We didn't talk a lot about this, and we kind of really think about it in a way that is like, having victim voices speaking. I think oftentimes as an organization, we get those requests to have a victim speak, but we are really conscientious that we don't want to put victims in a position or an area where they're re-traumatizing themselves, and we're not. We also don't want to re-exploit people too about their experiences. But if there is a space that we can create for people to speak, like we will create that space for people to speak. But hearing your local community organizations like that's effective as well, especially what you're seeing on the ground and how can your local government support, whether it's additional funding, whether it's local ordinances that may need to be changed, or one of the things when I worked for the city of Minneapolis Health Department as part of our city's legislative planning, legislative agenda, oftentimes I would be one of the few people on our team that worked at the health department at the time, where we had an opportunity to provide feedback and input on what should be on the legislative agenda for the city. And so I use that as an opportunity for my community partners to say, hey, this sounds like this needs to change. I'm going to bring it up to our local level changes that need to happen, but I'm also going to include that within our larger legislative agenda. And I was surprised it actually made it through there. Like I ended up having a meeting with our director of government relations at the time, and they just were excited. Like this is the first time we've actually talked about. At the time it was around healthy relationships with youth and addressing what at the time we were having a pretty significant and still are having a pretty significant outbreak of gonorrhea and chlamydia. And so they were really glad that I brought that to their attention, that we could tie some of our legislative work both locally and at the state level to kind of address and highlight some of that stuff. And so I think there's again quoting a strong quote from Tuesday, like those pearls that I was able to develop and working with my community partners and getting that information into just an ingenious way to think about change at all different levels. So we're going to finish this rest of our session off. We have 4 scenarios that we want to talk
really,
about.
Really quick, Nigel, I'm sorry, but first of all, I'd like to defend the Hennepin County SMART team. The reason why we weren't doing policy work is because I left. I don't know if you remember this, but we were going to produce a community needs assessment. And remember, I kept talking about how I wanted it to be shiny and glossy. I wanted it to be on the kind of paper that you couldn't even recycle, because I wanted to go to county commissioners and city councilors and say things like, one of the things that we discovered, we did informational group interviews, which are a lot like focus groups with different people in the system. And we interviewed the Minneapolis Police Department patrol. So we had representation from all 5 precincts. And one of the facilitators was trying to get at the question of if they were using children to interpret. So language line came up, and then they told us that due to budget cuts, none of them had cell phones anymore that were issued through the department. And we never would have known that if we hadn't done these informational group interviews. But that was, I mean, like I personally was like, are you kidding me right now? You are the largest law enforcement agency in the state of Minnesota and you don't have cell phones? Like, does the city council know that? Do county commissioners know that? So I think you can, do work like that at the local level, but also like, in other words, it doesn't have to go all the way to like the state legislature, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead, because yeah, we should do our scenarios.
Yeah, I totally remember that. I remember that was like a topic for quite a few meetings. And then it got a question, and maybe do we want to answer it now or hold off until the question answer time? It was just about kind of a dual purpose of having an executive committee leadership and then also a community group leadership, and any examples of successes of that.
Let's go through the breakouts for, or the scenarios first, and then we'll come back. Is that okay?
Yep, that'll work. Yep, so we have 4 questions and scenarios that we're going to work through. I think with our time left, I thought we would probably try to get through 3, but maybe we'll only be able to get through to 2. So our first scenario, and just before we start, there's no wrong answers here. Again, we're asking people to share back respectively in a constructive way. And so like I said, this is really just an opportunity to kind of utilize kind of what we taught you, but also looking at the experiences you may have had and how can we also learn from you as within the work that we do. So our first scenario, All Lives Matter. During an online meeting, the chair facilitating the group commented about her concerns in centering a training around the needs of Black, Indigenous folks who have experienced exploitation or trafficking. A comment was put into the chat box about All Lives Matter that resulted in the chair repeating the comment and reaffirming the belief they had in terms of the concerns around centering Black and Indigenous voices within the training. The comment resulted in most of the participants reacting negatively by shutting down personally themselves for the rest of the meeting, and at least one person commenting in the chat box about the lack in addressing the comment. The coordinator did not step in to address the comment either, resulting in further negative responses after the meeting via email. For folks that feel comfortable responding, how would they have handled this situation, and what is the better way that the coordinator or the facilitator could have addressed this in the immediate? And you should be able to unmute yourself, and if you feel more comfortable, you can also put it in the chat box.
I'll take a shot at it. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, Barrett.
Yes.
I'm Barrett Chris's, a detective with the city of Buffalo. I've been involved with investigating sexual violence for 28 years as a full-time detective. I've been a cop for 34 years. Worked with MNCASA and human trafficking protocol development, and trained through DHS statewide conferences and curriculum development, mostly in child sexual assault, MDT cases. But with that, you mentioned earlier, you're talking about discomfort and uncomfortable settings and how leadership, and that's what this is about. So I'll draw from a class in grad school at Humphrey about working in teams, and about when we're dealing with conflict of sorts. To get to a better place, we want to actually get to that zone of discomfort, right? We want to get past the Minnesota nice, and hopefully we have someone from New York in there that's getting real, like Jude, and we get into that zone of discomfort. Of course, the analogy was like that of, you can't have a rainbow without a thunderstorm. So, that kind of fits. But one of the negative trade-offs, or unintended, maybe intended positives, is getting through some objectionable, hopefully not hurtful comments during that zone of discomfort. So I would, you have ground rules about working in teams, and I think the facilitator might try to, I don't know what happened in this case, if that was laid out, or if the person who brought this All Lives Matter up missed that portion at the beginning, was late, or wasn't paying attention, or didn't care, or didn't think it applied to him or her. So maybe when it's addressed head on, that would be my choice in this. And of course, hindsight's 2020. So based on your feedback, it's certainly suggesting that, something should have been done. So I guess maybe facilitators these days, now more than ever, this should be one that we might want to be prepared for, to address. As succinctly, perhaps, as real, and to be as sensitive as we can to the person that made that comment, but yet explain also how it affects numerous others, that simple statement. So, and that of course would be without getting into the grit and the whole world of that conversation, because we're keeping a focus, right, on what we're all here to do together. So I would say try to redirect as well would be part of that solution.
Thank you, Barrett. Any other feedback or comments on how they would have handled this, or how the coordinator facilitator could have done better? Checking our chat box as well.
I'm supposed to be checking the chat, aren't I? No one's chatted anything in.
Give a moment for the silence. So this is based on a real scenario that happened that I got involved in because it happened to my staff member. They were doing a training. Like I said, they were putting together a training, and the chair who came from advocacy kind of was making this comment about the concerns about centering this training around Black Indigenous folks. And, a lot of the work was really dedicated that way because a lot of our state data shows that those that are being exploited or trafficked are largely Black and Indigenous folks. The comment that was made by a state law enforcement officer in the chat box, and it was caught by my staff member, and they responded to the facilitators, "You're really not going to say anything about this, or you're really not going to do anything about this?" I think part of the reason why people shut down was a lot of the folks that were in the planning meeting were Black and Indigenous themselves, and kind of, I think we're just taken aback that a comment was made like that. I think some other factors that were also kind of playing into this. I think the aftermath of some of the follow-up that the coordinators and facilitators did, the person said they did it as tongue-in-cheek. I don't know how you could say something like that tongue-in-cheek, just given also at the same time, this was in the weeks preceding and during the Derek Chauvin trial. So I think a lot of people are really on edge. I got pulled in because my staff member wasn't happy. And so I emailed the coordinator and say, what happened here? Like, this is unacceptable. And we had a follow-up meeting, and quite a other few folks had a follow-up meeting. I wasn't personally happy, or didn't really find any comfort in the meeting, because they just failed to acknowledge the harm that happened in the chat box. And at the end of the day, it was about acknowledging like the All Lives Matter chat and saying like this means something drastically different in the time we're living in. And so after some of these meetings happened, there was another follow-up email, again calling out, it was calling out, but it wasn't, again, still addressing the comment, and there was really no constructive follow-up steps afterwards. After that, I think our supervisor's still on her. Artika had another follow-up conversation with them that kind of resulted in kind of the same flat response. And then it's kind of a still ongoing situation. So we just got an email last week, finally acknowledging, you know, what happened in the chat and what happened in the meeting, and then also providing some resources for people to access, including at least one training that was is being held by one of our local agencies serving Indigenous victims of crime. I think, and the other thing that the coordinators and facilitators, I think, also acknowledged too, that their failure to address and respond in an appropriate way at the time. I think for them, where they were coming from is that they're still trying to figure out their kind of you know, ways to address this as, you know, two white women talking about kind of racial equity matters in a way that's they feel like they're contributing and not taking away from anyone's experience. And so I think in those pieces, I'm glad that those harms are acknowledged, but I think this is something, again, kind of ongoing. How do we prevent, or how do we address this in future meetings so that people don't feel like they're not being heard, or that you know, when harm happens within a meeting, you know, not making sure that's addressed right away rather than letting it linger, because we're 2 months from that meeting and are still talking about it, and people, they still haven't met as a result of this either. Okay. Next scenario, is this me or you, Jude?
Oh, I'm not on mute. I can't remember, but we were both there at this situation. Do you want to take it, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I could. It is me.
Okay.
So during a TA training with the new SART team, one of the members of the team expressed concerns that the direction of the team did not reflect the experiences that they were seeing with victims and survivors. The member felt that did not feel that there was a purpose to continue with participation, particularly since they've been having difficulties attending due to their busy schedule. Another member chimed in with a response that the other participant was not attending the meetings regularly, so they shouldn't be surprised by the direction. And further went on to point out that if everyone else can make time for meetings with their own busy schedules, that should not be an excuse. How would you have handled this situation moving forward, given the obvious conflict?
Can I chime in here for a second? And I mean, you might be looking at the scenario and being like, that's not even a conflict. No, these people were yelling at each other. Okay. And Nigel and I were like, what?
I forgot to mention that they were at full volume.
We were like, what's happening right now?
Hello, everybody. I'm going to just jump in. My name is Kimberly Peabody. I am Director of Health Promotion and Prevention Services, and recently given the title of Deputy Title IX Coordinator for Training and Prevention. So, so I am the leader of the SART team on our campus. However, there is another team on campus that actually probably does more of the functions of the SART, which I am a member of. So I would probably jump in and just ask everyone to calm down, basically. And I think it's a good opportunity to talk about you know, like respecting each other, and that you know, that means, you know, using a, you know, a inside voice, if you will, and that kind of thing. But I think this is another one of those storming kinds of things, and that it's a good opportunity to talk about what the group's expectations are for involvement a good opportunity to, um, if this is the direction that everyone at that meeting discussed, that it would be, to me, we would want everyone to be on the same page. So I think it would be worth taking the time to talk about how did we come to this conclusion, and to talk a little bit more about what experiences are they seeing that is not reflected in our current direction. So that's how I would handle it. But I'm sure that was awkward. And I'm sure that there were some personalities. So there's probably been some conflict between these two members before. It sounds like if, there may be some other things not necessarily going on within the SART team, but, in the work, they've had some conflict. So, but I think for the best of the group is that, it's a great time to reinforce how we need to respect each other, talk to each other, and respect everyone's perspective. So, so that's what I would do. And then I would have a conversation with both of them afterwards, and talk to them about, that, just about the situation, so that they could have a place to talk about it, but also talk about my expectations as the leader of the group, that these kind of behaviors is not okay.
So I was the site coordinator of this team.
Mm-hmm.
The SVGI came in and did a 2.5-day training. And one of the facilitators for Minnesota, him, his name is Paul Schnell, and he's now the commissioner of the Department of Corrections. So this thing happened, and I was like, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. Like, because we had formed before we were funded. So we weren't getting technical assistance before. So I was like, I'm so embarrassed. Like, you guys acted out in front of the SVGI and la, 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 and this is terrible and whatever. And I remember Paul Schnell being like, Jude, because Paul and I were on a team together way back in the late 90s. So he was like, Jude, this is beautiful. Like, what just happened? Like, I'm sorry they yelled at each other, but exactly what you were saying. He was like, Jude, this isn't the Jude Foster team. This is the Hennepin County SMART team. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not like Jude's little project. Like, they're taking ownership. And one of these members was really frustrated with another one because you're not taking this work seriously. Like, she held her accountable. So Paul's like, what happened was beautiful. And I was like, it doesn't feel beautiful at all. Because I was a pretty green site coordinator. It was my second team, but I had never led a SART before. And also one of the people was Nigel's boss.
Oh, wow. So that was really awkward.
But I believe this was before or around the time I first became co-chair. And then the other person there was my predecessor, Leah Lutz, that also kind of walked us through along with Paul as well. And it didn't really need us to take care of it because we broke, and then the two of them got together and talked about it. And by the end, they were hugging. So I think they were glad that the other pushed on each other like that. Like, you don't get lightning in a bottle like that a lot. But it did, I think things that had to be said were said. And I think it was like Jude said, Paul said it was gold, and it was a good example. I'm trying to remember afterwards, I did talk to my supervisor about this, and I was like, I think you were in the right to, call them out again. the difference between calling out and calling in. If I knew then what I knew now, but I think I probably really pushed back. I was like, you probably didn't need to like get really loud about it. But I mean, every time after that, they were like totally fine. Like they took no, they didn't take it personal. And, the other person is a advocate that I've known for a long time, and I love working with them and I love seeing them every time. And, I don't see my former supervisor as much, but I said this to someone the other day because I know my supervisor works at the city now. It's like, yep, they're really good people in terms of like, everyone's gonna have a fun time with them, but you have to set up some boundaries with them in terms of the professional capacity. So I don't think you're always going to 100% get a scenario that kind of works itself out. But I think if you create that space where people can come together and talk about it, that shows the effectiveness of being on the same page and having that consensus about conversations. And then, again, they were able to kind of go to the side and, take care of it and understood where each other was coming from to move forward. And I think, after that, like we really did not have a ton of conflict on the Hennepin County SMART team. And I think having that situation, it really gave people the opportunity to be honest about things and the experiences that they were having. But it was embarrassing to say the least for me that it was my supervisor. But I think it's these things happen, and you gotta, like, just with that last scenario, like, you gotta acknowledge them in the moment, or they're gonna linger and they're gonna create toxicity and build out every meeting after that. Right. I think we'll just do one more scenario and get the question. And this is your scenario, Jude.
It sure is. Okay, again, this is based on a true story, but I cannot tell you which SART it is. But a SART had been having some heated conversations about one of the partner's practices that were not victim-centered. The partner had a history of having a lack of transparency and collaboration with other SART members. A frustrated member, convinced that the partner would never be held accountable, leaked information to a local television reporter. A sensationalized story ran a couple of weeks later. How would you handle this?
I'm not entirely sure that there's a role here, that there's a responsibility for you to handle this. I almost see it as, two independent members of the, albeit team, and their relationship. Sort of like staying out of your siblings' relationship with your shared parents at times, right? Mom and dad are lonely, how come you're not calling them? But I'm probably short-sighted. That's just my initial reaction. I guess there's always something that, relationship building, mending, there might be a place for a conversation with higher ups at the team members' organizations. Those are the first thoughts I have.
Yeah, I was thinking if that happened at our university, boy, some heads would roll. Leaking information to the press? Never. And there would be, everyone signs a confidentiality kind of agreement, so that participates in our because, as an employee. So like I said, it would be, so I guess it depends on context, but like I said, at a university, that would be a huge problem. And not only would it need to be handled by the leader of the SART team, but I'm sure administration, like the president of the university, would be all in that.
Yeah. What do you think something like that does for trust on the team?
Oh, it diminishes it. That's part of, I guess what I was saying too is, or trying to imply, I was wondering, is the confidentiality, because you would hope that those conversations are internal and to the group. And
this is my other co-presenter.
Yes. And that, at some point, that person really took a huge leap. I mean, which probably would result in many individuals not wanting to even be a part of the group anymore for fear that if they don't agree with something or, whatever, it'll be taken to the press. That could destroy the whole team.
Yeah, and I think a lot of SARTs, especially SARTs that aren't doing like case file review or aren't acute SARTs, I don't know how many SARTs are signing confidentiality agreements. So I was on a multidisciplinary team at the University of Minnesota Duluth when I lived there, and I don't remember signing a confidentiality form, probably because we weren't getting into the nitty gritty. We were talking more about policy and Title IX and those kinds of things. And in this situation, this site coordinator was really, really, really upset. I mean, there was a teary phone call that I took from her because she just really needed support. But, feeling like, wow, and at the end of the day, from my perspective, and this is just my perspective, the partner that this team member was really frustrated with had no transparency and wasn't invested in victim survivor practices. So I understood where that frustration was coming from. But yeah, and then to see that on the news, right? Other thoughts?
Well, it kind of depends on what you're talking about that was in the news, right? I mean, was it something that was malfeasance? Was it, or just people aren't getting along on a team? It sounds to me like it was something that might have been worthy of, community notification, if you will. I get that it's going to affect the trust, but we have integrity and we must do what's right. And it certainly would have been better if there's some way that person with the conscience, rather than going to the media, could have addressed it in another way or anonymously to that team member's supervisor on whatever discipline that team member came from, and giving it some time instead of maybe rushing out to the media, but which that, if that's what happened, it does suggest the possibility of prior relationship issues. And this whole thing with trust, it comes down to team building and getting to know each other, building that trust, of course, as you're all familiar with. And I'm a big believer in those ground rules, some written rules that we come up with as a team, so we can have our expectations and accountabilities in place, and what we're going to do if someone's not showing up for a meeting or isn't being transparent, and how we're going to kind of police ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, like I can see both sides of this, you know, like I know why this person was so frustrated. But yeah, that just destroyed trust on this team. And yeah, and I do think it was an important issue to bring up. It's the way that it was brought up. But I think that like this news story was a symptom of something much bigger, right? So it's kind of like taking that step back and saying, you know, Houston, we have a problem here that we really have to look at, right? But also looking at the relationships on that team.
Yeah, to your point, Barrett, you know, revisit, you know, I think it's important that when you put those agreements together, you know, it's not just about your first time talking about them and putting them together, but revisiting them throughout the life of your team. And when I was on the coordinating our Minnesota Indians missing emergencies women's task force, every meeting, whether it was a main meeting or a subcommittee meeting, we'd always start off with reviewing our values and taking some time to add to those as well. We did that for pretty much the first 6 months. When COVID happened, we were not meeting as often. And the reward meeting was really in small chunks to try to coordinate everyone's time that was part of their own response team through COVID. And then when we kind of were able to get back to the place where we had a little bit longer meeting, we came back and visited those values. Yeah, it's trust. It's like huge. Like I don't feel like I would have made it as far as I did without having like someone like you to trust and build a relationship. And our Zoom is saying we have 22 minutes, but I have that we actually have like 14 minutes left. So I'm not going to go through our other scenario, but I just kind of end with our scenarios. Like these are, you know, some of these scenarios probably seem absurd and maybe you would never experience them in your time, or maybe you have way more absurd experiences. But when me and Jude were talking about these, like, what is the craziest thing that ever happened to us that people are like, that would never happen? And they did. So I think learning from these scenarios, I think, you know, the more outlandish they are, I think the better prepared you are. I think for me, you know, when I'm, you know, walking to meetings like this, or when I was facilitating meetings like these, I would try to, again, think about it and like, how do I respond to things as they come up, and kind of think of the worst case scenario, knowing that, you know, even whatever happens would be like the smallest bar to jump through. And so I'm hoping that from these scenarios, people have an opportunity to learn from some things and recognize like it's not the end of the world when you have these things happen. I think I'm better for having these experiences and learning from them, and having, you know, whether it's at the time I felt like maybe I failed in those experiences. Again, there's a lot I learned from having these experiences. And you know, as you're going through your work and you're moving through your work, like I think things, you know, having a good team around you to support you, having those abilities to build space for your time, whether it's with your co-chair or your leadership on your team or your supervisor, someone at work that you know that you can talk to and trust and debrief. I think that's always really key and important. And then, you know, tomorrow's a new day. And here on questions. So I'm going to go back to the one question we got in the chat box.
Right, I forgot about that.
So one thing that we're considering for their SART was establishing a leadership or executive committee within the community group as well. The leadership group would be the ones that really work on things, improve things are working. The community group that would be more of a report out to the community and organizations that want to stay and fund their efforts. Any thoughts or examples of this occurring and whether it's successful or not? So I haven't had an experience like this. And I know we've internally been talking about how do we, you know, build space within SARTs for communities to be involved. I think something that was unique about our Hennepin County team that are, you know, outside of kind of our, you know, typical 5 that show up, you know, law enforcement, prosecution, advocacy, corrections and forensic medical. I think Jude was very intentional about creating space on there for community and having those representation from community service agencies. I feel like you kind of had a similar thing recently that you kind of developed with some of the SACI work, kind of the core group and other groups that could learn from the group.
Yeah. So the thing about Saki is that we keep finding out that we don't know what we don't know. And so trying to like wrap our heads around doing a statewide project. So we want to support communities that are submitting their unsubmitted kits, because we don't want people or communities to just submit kits. Oh, Megan just said we have 10 minutes left. We don't want to just like test kits. That's not the spirit of Saki. What the spirit of Saki is about victim-centered, trauma-informed victim notification, accountability from all of us, not just law enforcement, but all of us. And then hopefully cold case investigation and cold case prosecution. So what we have kind of figured, we just kept adding as we went to more jurisdictions. We just kept inviting advocacy and law enforcement at bare minimum to our larger MDT group. And, you know, it's like, you guys, we can't have an MDT with like 5,000 people in it. Like, that's just not gonna be effective. So we're still, I mean, I'm a big fan of let's try it out. Let's try it out. And if it doesn't work, we'll stop doing it. It can't hurt and it could help, right? So now what we're kind of doing is we're keeping, because in our statewide Saki grant, what we decided to do was pilot the project in Anoka County, which is just north of the Twin Cities. So we're keeping it to that core group. So Anoka County folks, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, MINCASA, Office of Justice Programs. Like, we're keeping it to that group, but then we're gonna have a larger group. So like Minneapolis can come, St. Cloud can come, Rochester can come. I am a huge fan of when you are a site coordinator having co-chairs, because otherwise, again, I didn't want any of the teams I worked with, but in particular, Southern St. Louis County and Hennepin County to be Jude's project or Jude's team. I wanted more of that buy-in. And so I'm a huge fan of having co-chairs, and not so much Nigel, but like co-chairs before you became co-chair. I'm going to be fair. I ended up facilitating the frickin' meeting. Okay, I just did. But you know, we talked about it beforehand. Like, we talked about the agenda. We talked about all of that stuff. So it wasn't like my show, if that makes sense. I don't know if that answered your question.
I think another thing too, when you're thinking about kind of that community connection and how you're doing your work and how you're showing up, like, I think be intentional and honest about the communities you're showing up in and kind of what to expect from your work. Like, if you're there just to kind of share, don't be upfront about like, this is here for sharing, or are you looking at kind of getting that feedback you need from the community to help better your responses, inform your protocol. You know, in some cases when you're thinking about communities that have been marginalized by structures, like, there may be some kind of reconciliation that needs to happen as well. And so I think when you're thinking about your community involvement, community engagement strategies, like I mentioned before, the work that I did at the Department of Public Safety was, you know, based in community engagement. I often would be finding myself in situations where I had to apologize on behalf of the department for actions that they took. And so that was part of reconciliation, and recognize, like, moving forward, we want a stronger and better relationship. You know, how do we reconciliation has to be one of those steps in the way. And I'm just curious for other folks too, you know, not just me and Jude answering questions, but other folks that in their SART work, if they have thoughts about that community piece and its involvement in those leadership structures as well. I think for sure, you know, any SART team, any multidisciplinary team you have, I think it's, I think you need some sort of leadership structure. I think again, how are you developing it together as a team and coming to consensus and deciding kind of what that role looks like and what they're responsible for, and have everyone be comfortable signing off on kind of what their duties are and then how does that look for the rest of the team as well. But, any other thoughts about community leadership team with SART that people have implemented or have their own experiences with? Any other questions? Okay.
I have a question, Nigel.
Yeah.
Did you just put an evaluation in the chat?
Yes. To help us, we ask that you please fill out our post-session survey. I'm on my phone because we have a little chat box. I'm getting some feedback from our other staff that there might be an issue if you could try to hop on the Survey Monkey, saying that you already took it.
Oh,
So if that happens when we are finished for today, we'll send out it. I think we'll send out another email for post-session survey so people can fill those out. But we will be doing that every day after each of our sessions. As I said before, it helps us really with planning and thinking about future national institutes and how we can, you know, provide good topics and just for us as speakers and our other speakers that are coming in, how we can better our approaches. But I just want to thank everyone again for this afternoon and spending your time with us this afternoon. Again, our next session will be on June 15th, starting at 12 p.m. Central. That'll be the third session will also be our second day of breakout rooms. So we'll start it off how we did today, you know, doing some checking in and then breaking off into the different breakout rooms. If people are interested, they will keep the main room open for a little bit if there's any questions or anything that people want to hop back in there. But thank you so much for everybody that was here today, and thank you so much for sharing with us, and have a good rest of the day, week, and weekend, and we'll see you all on Tuesday.
Are we going back to the main room?
We have a few minutes left just in case.
Oh, look, Artika's clapping. Thank you, Artika.
Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, great job. Great presentation.
Thank you.
I loved your examples, good scenarios, real life
Oh, yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably not even the craziest thing that's happened to me.
That's what I was thinking as well.
And then when we were at Coffee Collab this morning, I was saying to Jude, or I was telling everybody, it's like, I woke up this morning wondering, is the hokey pokey a real thing or did I make that up? So that's where I'm at today, Jude. You might have to do some more heavy lifting.
And Nigel was like, is it hokey pokey or hanky panky? And I was like, it's the hokey pokey, Nigel.
It's the hokey pokey.
I just realized I'm still recording too.